crucible that was the American Civil War to the wars and conflicts abroad in Europe, Southeast Asia, and the Middle East, witnessed the courage, resolve, and sacrifice of those who served and represented not only the United States, but also the Pennsylvania State University. June 27, 1863. I sent a letter to all parents whose boys left with the militia. I am very anxious to hear from them. I fear they may be kept away longer than expected, and unless something decisive in our favor is soon done against Lee's army opposite Washington, I fear the invasion will become much more serious than it has been. We are going on as usual, though with very diminished numbers. That's a letter written by Evan Pugh, the first president of what was at that time called the Agricultural College of Pennsylvania, the school that would ultimately become Penn State. He was writing to Hugh McAllister, one of the college's original Board of Trustee members. Just 2 weeks earlier, Pennsylvania Governor Andrew Kern issued an emergency call for volunteer soldiers to protect the state. General Robert E. Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia were on their way north. A Confederate invasion in Pennsylvania was imminent. There was another challenge for Pugh, who had a vision to grow the school, but since the Civil War's outbreak in 1861, struggled to retain students who believed it was their duty to fight. In the first days of July 1863, just southeast of State College in the rolling hills and fields outside the small town of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, students and faculty, some fighting on the side of the Union and others for the Confederacy, engaged in the bloodiest battle ever fought on American soil. The outcome would not only determine the course of the nation, but also that of Penn State University. This is the story of Penn State and Gettysburg. Before that fateful battle in the fierce heat of early July 1863, tensions were mounting in America, and the same could be said for the Agricultural College of Pennsylvania. Like the nation, the college's students and faculty were divided in the cause to preserve the Union. Signs of this division emerged early on. During the 1860 election year, someone at the college hung an Abraham Lincoln dummy outside an old main window. A few years later, as the Civil War raged on, a serious fight broke out on campus when farmers who had been attending a pro-Confederacy rally in Bellefonte rode past in their wagons through campus, yelling cheers for the Confederate President Jefferson Davis. A student at the college named Tellico Johnson remembers the farmers' taunting yells, and he witnessed the heated exchange that followed. He later wrote, "Some of the students heard it and yelling, 'Come on, boys,' dashed toward the road. Soon a crowd of students followed, stopped the teasers, dragged the men out, broke one man's joint, and got a rope to hang one of them. A few other students intervened and prevented any violence, telling the farmers to leave campus immediately, but emotions ran high. The fervor and bitterness of war had gripped the college. The institution that would become Penn State was in its infancy. At the outset of the Civil War, the college was less than a decade old. Its founding president, Evan Pugh, had a vision to grow the school beyond its agricultural roots, to expand the curriculum, expand the campus, expand the student body. The Morrill Act of 1862, which granted land to select state educational institutions to be used for establishing and funding growth, seemed to Pugh the answer to this vision. He began aggressively lobbying to secure the state's sole land grant status. But the Civil War became a roadblock, one that threatened Pugh's ambitions. The war was chipping away at his school. When the Civil War started in 1861, several students chose to leave the college. Penn State professor and Civil War historian Carol Reardon explains what could have motivated students to leave and why it was a struggle for President Pugh to hold them back.
President Evan Pugh was very concerned about his ability to keep the doors open. The young men in college are, of course, of prime age to serve in the military. For a lot of different reasons, whether it was because their friends were going, or whether it was out of patriotism, or whether it was for the money, this was the prime pool of manpower that the armies wanted anyhow.
In July 1862, as the war gained momentum, President Lincoln called for an additional 300,000 volunteer soldiers. The school's first postmaster, Robert Forster, began a recruiting effort at the college after Lincoln's call. Despite President Pugh's objections, several students left with Postmaster Forster and joined the 148th Pennsylvania Volunteer Infantry, known throughout the Union Army as the Center County Infantry. But not all students who felt compelled to leave the school enlisted with the Union. Two students, Mordecai Lewis and William McAllister, who was the nephew of Board of Trustees member Hugh McAllister, left school and joined the ranks of the Confederacy. It should be noted that Hugh McAllister witnessed the war divide both the school and his family. Besides his nephew William, McAllister had two brothers who served in the war. One fought for the Union, one fought for the Confederacy. Each brother vowed to never speak to the other again. This was a personal war, and its effects extended far beyond the battlefields. Those at the Agricultural College of Pennsylvania were experiencing this firsthand. Still, even in the face of the war and with a diminishing student body, President Pugh pressed on. In April 1863, there arose a glimmer of hope. The Agricultural College of Pennsylvania was officially designated the state's sole land-grant institution. Pugh's perseverance paid off. But the relief and joy of this success was short-lived. Robert E. Lee and the Confederacy were on their way north, soon to enter Pennsylvania. In June 1863, news confirmed the Confederates were launching an offensive into the north and quickly approaching Pennsylvania. Fear spread like wildfire. A tremendous sense of urgency overwhelmed the state. Governor Andrew Kern made a call for 50,000 volunteer troops, issuing a state of emergency. Kern's words dominated the headlines. "I must rely upon the people for the defense of the state." Thousands of Pennsylvania men volunteered themselves for the protection of the Commonwealth. Among them were students from the Agricultural College of Pennsylvania. More of Pugh's students and some faculty, bound by a sense of obligation and loyalty to their state, rejected the president's pleas to remain and enlisted in local militias to repel the Confederate offensive. Following an exodus of students in June, Pugh was inundated with letters from concerned parents, many of whom were infuriated that their young sons were permitted to leave. In a letter addressed to President Pugh on June 29, 1863, John Seidel, father of Jonathan Albert Seidel, a student who enlisted in a company in Boalsburg following Kern's call, wrote how he, and particularly his wife, were upset. "Dr. Pugh, I write to say that Mrs. Seidel was quite dissatisfied with you for letting Albert go to the army when he was put in your care. Boys of 16 years are not quite capable of judging for themselves what they ought to do in such serious matters." President Pugh did his best to inform and respond to concerned parents of students. This was all he could do. For the students and faculty who left, the decision was made. Their fate, the nation's fate, and the school's fate would largely be shaped by a mighty battle to be fought in the southeastern fields of Pennsylvania. Lee's 72,000-man army, along with thousands of horses and mules, hundreds of cannons, and hundreds of wagons and ambulances, poured into Pennsylvania in late June 1863. They approached a small crossroads town where several important roads and a rail line converged, a town called Gettysburg. On the morning of July 1st, 1863, shots rang out when leading divisions of Lee's army came in contact with Union infantry and cavalry at the northwest outskirts of town. The Union troops put up a vigorous defense, then fell back to high ground alongside Cemetery Ridge. The Battle of Gettysburg had begun. Late in the evening on July 1st, 1863, as night set in, Robert Forster, the former postmaster at the college, approached Gettysburg with the 148th Pennsylvania Volunteer Infantry. Forster was now a captain in the infantry for Company C, the company in which several students from the college enlisted. The infantry had been called up in late June to reinforce Union defenses. The sound of cannons echoed in the distance as Forster and his company got closer to town. They encountered a grim indication of what was to come. An ambulance passed them, and inside they saw the dead body of the widely revered General John Reynolds, who was shot and killed earlier that day. Forster and the 148th settled for the night behind the Union line. Lemuel Osmond, a soldier in Forster's company, spent the night with the captain. He fell asleep listening to Forster pray that God would be with the infantry the next day. The battle broke out again the morning of July 2nd, 1863. The Union defense took the form of a fishhook. Near the left flank of the Union defense, the 148th was positioned, where several students from the college prepared for battle. Across the battlefield, two old classmates were in Confederate gray. William McAllister was positioned with his battery unit on Benner's Hill, where an intense artillery duel occurred in the early afternoon. And Mordecai Lewis, who rose to become a sergeant in the 2nd Virginia Infantry, participated in multiple attempts to take over Union troops on Culp's Hill. Over on the Union line, those in the 148th soon found themselves in the thick of the battle. After an ill-advised order by Union General Daniel Sickles, Union troops were left exposed near the overly extended defensive left flank. Historian Carol Reardon explains General Sickles' blunder and Union Commander General George Meade's response.
Sickles has taken his 3rd Corps, detached it from the whole rest of the Union Army, and stuck it out way forward. General Meade rides out to General Sickles, sees what he's done, and finally Sickles says, "Sorry, sir, I'll pull my men back to where you want them." And General Meade looks at General Sickles and says, "Fine, move your men back if General Lee will let you."
Confederate troops exploited the blunder, advancing troops and directing artillery fire into the field of ripening wheat the Union troops were left exposed in. Union Commander General George Meade immediately called for reinforcements. The 148th took off toward the wheat field. The sight was overwhelming. The sunlight reflected from thousands of highly polished bayonets and musket barrels, a surgeon in the 148th later wrote. Another private in the 148th Infantry later remarked, "The smoke from the batteries rose in huge volumes like heavy summer clouds, enveloping the combatants and obscuring the sun. The wheat flew in the air all over the field as they were cut off by enemy bullets." Captain Forster and Company C were among those who rushed to reinforce the Union defense. Historian Carol Reardon explains the position of Forster's company and the 148th Infantry as they entered the wheat field.
Here comes the 148th. Company C are the color company, which means they're in the center of the regimental line, which means that those soldiers are the ones that will be carrying the battle flags and will be defending the battle flags. They're going to be the targets of an awful lot of Southern rifles. It's a horrible place to be.
The soldier who was by Captain Forster's side the night before, Lemuel Osmond, was with Forster while they engaged in a series of charges and countercharges in the effort to hold the Union line. Osmond later recalled his captain's courage and composure amidst the fight. Captain Forster said, "They are falling back, boys, forward. The barrel of my gun had got hot and dry and I couldn't force a ball down. I stepped back and told Captain Forster, who told me to throw it down and hunt another. I threw it down, ran along the line, got one in Company I. When I came back, the captain was dead. The blood was running down his cheek." Captain Robert Forster was shot in the forehead and died almost immediately. He was one of more than 20,000 men who fought in the wheat field on July 2, 1863. More than 6,000 became casualties in 3 hours. The Union line had held firm, but the battle was far from over. Unable to flank the Union defense, Confederate Commander General Robert E. Lee ordered an infantry assault aimed at the Union center. In the early afternoon of July 3, 1863, more than 12,000 Confederate soldiers were sent over the open fields, an approximate 3/4 of a mile. Heavy Union artillery and rifle fire poured down upon them. The 148th Infantry, though not at the spearhead of the Confederate thrust, watched as the Confederacy reached its high tide and assisted in taking more than 400 prisoners during the action. George Pickett, one of the Confederate generals who led the assault, returned to the Confederates' line after the charge. He was met by General Lee, who was consoling the remaining exhausted retreating troops. Lee attempted to reorganize the line and asked Pickett to reform his division. General Pickett turned to him and said, "General Lee, I have no division." Lee's infantry assault on July 3, 1863 marked the end to the Battle of Gettysburg and an end to the Confederate invasion into the North. Pickett's charge had failed. The Battle of Gettysburg resulted in more than 50,000 casualties. The devastation it caused reached far beyond the ravaged town and surrounding fields of Gettysburg. A nation faced the brutal reality of its bitter division. Brother had fought against brother, classmate against classmate. The Battle of Gettysburg had been a turning point. The momentum shifted to the Union. But the war was not over. Many more lives would be lost. But less than 2 years after the Battle of Gettysburg, on April 9, 1865, General Robert E. Lee surrendered his army to the Union at the Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. A long road of recovery and reconciliation lied ahead for the nation and for the Agricultural College of Pennsylvania. In total, 31 students from the college enlisted with the Union during the war, several of whom fought at Gettysburg alongside Captain Forster, whose body was taken from the Gettysburg battlefield and was buried in a cemetery just a few miles outside the Penn State campus. Several of the students would return to the college to complete their degrees. Mordecai Lewis and William McAllister survived the Battle of Gettysburg and the remainder of the war, but neither would return to State College. President Evan Pugh never lived to see the end of the war. He died in 1864 from typhoid fever. Pugh's vision, however, survived. The small college had endured the war, and like the nation, a new future awaited. Penn State reflects. Listen to the reactions of today's Penn State students and faculty after they learned about the university's involvement at the Battle of Gettysburg. Would you have listened to Curtin's call and left the college to fight in the war?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I probably would do it immediately because they're an imminent threat to my safety, and they probably had family here in Pennsylvania too who were in danger of the Confederate Army as well.
Did it surprise you that some students left the college and joined the Confederacy?
No, not really, because whether you fight for the Union or the Confederacy depended completely on your own values and morals. It's like West Point. A bunch of West Point graduates from those years, went to the Confederacy as well just because they were either from there or they had family down there.
Not particularly, because we had students here who were not from Pennsylvania.
I'm a little surprised that after being at Penn State for some time and having that spirit, it's a small campus and college, that they didn't want to all stick together.
Do you think it's important for today's Penn Staters to know about this history?
I think it's important for us to know our history, to know that, Penn Staters, there was 31 of them that decided, they chose to go ahead and do it, so it kind of shows the leadership that still is instilled in the college.
We talk a lot about the teaching mission, the research mission, and the service mission. A lot of times you hear about the teaching and the research. We don't always hear about the service mission. The service mission can take many shapes and forms, but one of them has been the military, as far as it being an important thread in the fabric of Penn State's history. Sure, we should take a look at it.
Absolutely. I think it's really important to know where Penn State came from. It's just kind of like a family tree, knowing where your roots are. I think it's important to know what Penn State's roots are, just so we know what we represent when we come here.